The tin cup stood on the boards of the drying loft, half full of rain, and at 2 in the morning the water in it began to ripple. Eleanor Pike was 23, and she had been paid in this building instead of money. Nobody in the counting house hid the laughing. She had no father, no husband, no lodging past quarter day, no trade the law would name as hers. She had one thing worth keeping, a bone-handled rag knife with her mother's initials filed into the blade, and her mother 4 years dead. £9, or a dead paper mill south of Maidstone. She had taken the mill instead. But what Silas Crowther did not know was that under the machine room floor, behind a wall of blackened brick, something was still turning, and within a year it would change not only her worth, but what every shop in the valley wrapped its goods in. Tell me in the comments whether you would have slept in that loft. To understand why she did not run out into the rain that night, you have to know what her mother had made her do every Saturday for 11 years. Mary Pike had sorted rags at the Toville warehouses from the age of 15 until the winter her lungs went bad. She brought her daughter into the sorting shed on the first Saturday after Eleanor turned 5, because there was nowhere else to put her, and because the shed was warm. There were sheets off dead men's beds, and shirts worn until the cloth had gone to lace at the elbows, and once a wedding dress cut up for cleaning cloths by somebody who had not wanted to look at it any longer. The work was to open the bales, cut the seams, take out buttons and hooks and pins, and put every piece into the right heap. Fine white linen went in one heap, colored cotton in another, and canvas and tarred stuff and anything with rubber in it went into the heap that was sold on for felt or burned. A sorter who put a colored rag into the white heap could spoil a whole vat of pulp 4 days later. The mill would send the bale back, and the warehouse would dock the wages of the shed. Eleanor learned to do it in the dark, and that was not a figure of speech, because the gas was poor at the south end and in December the light was gone by 4. The women worked on because the bales were paid by weight and not by daylight. So the hands learned what the eyes could not be trusted with. Linen felt cool and slightly dry, and it made a particular small noise when you drew it between finger and thumb, and cotton felt warmer and softer and went silent, and cloth that had been sized or dressed to look like linen felt right for the first half second and wrong after that. Her mother gave her the knife the morning after her 12th birthday. It had a bone handle gone yellow, and a short blade ground almost to a curve, with the initials MP filed into the steel near the bolster because sorters' knives went missing constantly. Mary Pike put it in her daughter's hand and said one thing about it. "Feel it before you look at it," she said. Eleanor took that to mean the rags, and it was 11 years before she understood how much else her mother had meant. The other thing the shed taught her was noise. The Toville shed stood close to the mills, and the mills ran night and day, and a girl who spent her childhood inside that sound learned it whether she wanted to or not. She knew the flat continuous roar of a rag engine working properly, and the change in it when the roll came down too hard on the plate and the stuff was being cut instead of brushed. She knew that the floor told you before the ears did, because the boards carried it into your feet while the ears were still full of the general din. Once, when she was 16, she told a foreman that the second engine was running rough. He told her to mind her heap, and the bearing ran hot 2 days later, and the mill lost a day and a half. The foreman was a man named Wilfred Sayers, 60, who had lost the top joints of 2 fingers to a rag cutter in 1841 and could still roll a cigarette faster than anybody in the shed. He went to live with his sister at Ashford in the spring of 1863, and Eleanor never saw him again. Mary Pike died in February of 1861, having buried 3 infants before Eleanor and none after, and she left a box bed, a copper kettle, 4 shillings and 8 pence, and the knife. Eleanor was 19, and she stayed in the trade because it was the trade she had and because she was good at it in a way that nobody thought worth paying for. By 1864 she was buying as well as sorting, and that was the part that mattered later. A merchant who wants rags sends somebody who can look at a farm cart full of filthy cloth and say what it is worth within a shilling, and who will not be cheated by a dealer who has damped a load down to make it weigh heavier. Eleanor walked to Wateringbury and to Yalding and out along the Luce Valley, and she bought by the hundredweight. She wrote what she paid in a small book with a marbled cover, and she was never once out at the weigh house. The man she did this for was Silas Crowther, 52, stationer and paper merchant, of a warehouse and counting house in Maidstone with his name on the lintel in gold. He was not a cruel man in the way that makes a good story, but something worse, a man who could look at a person for 4 years and never once form an opinion of them that would cost him anything. In August of 1865, A firm at Rochester that owed Crowther £400 went under. Crowther, who was short and did not intend to be short for long, began paying the people who could not sue him in slower money than the people who could. By the end of September, he owed Eleanor Pike £18 and 7 shillings. £6 of it was wages and £2.12 was commission on rags bought at his order. The rest, £9 15 shillings, was her own money, advanced out of her own pocket at Yalding and at Hunton in the last week of July, for stock that was sitting in his warehouse at that moment under his own tarpaulin. She asked for it 3 times, and the third time was the 11th of October, in the counting-house, with 2 clerks at the standing desks and a carrier waiting by the door with a docket in his hand. Crowther said he could not spare £18 in coin. He said he could spare 9, and that she might take it and think herself dealt with fairly, or she could take the papers on a property he held and be done with him altogether. One of the clerks laughed before Crowther had finished the sentence. He was a young man named Hollis, 24, with a very good coat, and he laughed the way men laugh when the joke has been agreed on in advance. The other clerk kept writing, and the carrier looked at the floor. The property was Blackthorn Mill, a paper mill on the Alder Brook about 2 miles south of Maidstone, standing since 1790-something, stopped since the spring of 1862. Crowther had taken it in part settlement of a debt from a bankrupt named Fairbrass and had been trying to get rid of it ever since. There was a lease on the ground at £4 a year, and no buyer at any price. The roof was going, and the machinery had been old before the old machinery was old. Eleanor stood at the counter and did not answer for long enough that Crowther looked up. Then she asked him one question, and it was not the question anybody in the room expected. "Does the water go with it?" she said. "The leet and the right to take water off the brook, or only the buildings?" Crowther said he neither knew nor cared, and that it was all written in the papers, and that she was welcome to read them at her leisure in whatever place she was going to be living after quarter day. She said she would take the mill. She signed the assignment on the 12th of October in front of a solicitor's clerk who had a cold and wrote her name wrong the first time, and it cost her 1 shilling and 6 in stamp duty. She walked out of the counting-house with a folded parcel of documents, her marbled buying book, £3 11 shillings in a tin, and no employment. The Maidstone people who knew her said she had gone soft in the head. The Toville people, who were harder, said she had been robbed and had chosen to call it a bargain so that she would not have to say out loud that she had been robbed. She walked out to see the mill that afternoon, and it was worse than she had let herself expect. So here is the thing worth holding on to before we go any further. What was moving under that floor, in a building that had stood dead for 3.5 years, with the wheel outside seized in its pit and the water long gone from the channel? If you have a guess, put it in the comments now, because Eleanor spent 9 days on the wrong answer, and the wrong answer is where you have to start. The lane down to Blackthorn ran between 2 hop gardens and dropped into the little valley of the Alder, and you smelled the mill before you saw it, because a paper mill left wet smells of size and mold and old bones. The main building was Kentish ragstone to the first floor and weatherboard above, and the boarding on the north face had gone grey and lifted where the nails rusted through. 22 tiles were off the roof over the east end, and the rain had been getting into the drying loft for 3 winters. So the laths had gone soft, and a run of louver boards had rotted at the pin and hung open like a broken shutter. The lead had been stripped off both valleys, and not by weather. Inside, the machine room floor was under an inch of black water at the low end, and 3 of the 4 vats had a foot of dried pulp in the bottom that had gone to a substance like felt and stank when she put her boot in it. Rats had been living in the rag store since the roof let go, and had been eating the size, and had died in it as well. She counted 9 of them in the first hour and stopped counting. A ream and a half of finished paper still lay on the sorting bench where somebody had walked away from it in the spring of 1862, swelled and cockled and knitted into one solid brick, and she could not get a single sheet off it. The water wheel outside was a breast wheel of about 14 feet with 2 of its arms gone, and it was not turning and was not going to turn. The head race that fed it was a shallow green trench with willow growing in it as thick as her wrist, because the brook had been let go round the other way years before and had made itself a new course, and there was no water in the wheel pit but rain. Tramps had used the counting room, where there was a fire scar on the flagstones and a pile of sacking, and somebody had taken the brass off the door furniture and the weights off the paper scales. The scale beam was still there, and it was the only thing in the building she looked at twice that first afternoon. She gave notice at her Maidstone lodging that evening to save the week, and came down on the 14th of October with a bundle, a blanket, the tin, a rush candle, and her knife. She had £3 9 shillings left and could not pay rent and eat and buy materials as well. So she made the drying loft over the east end her room, in the one bay where the roof was whole, and slept there through the autumn. The night of the 16th, it rained hard from about 9 o'clock, straight down and no wind by midnight, the kind of rain that goes into the ground rather than across it. She woke at 2, or a little after, and she could not have said what woke her. The tin cup was on the boards a foot from her head, half full of rain she had caught off the Louvre for washing, and the water in it was moving, not slopping. The surface was going in fine rings from the center outward, over and over, the way a cup of tea moves on a table when a heavy cart passes outside. There was no cart, and no wind in the loft. She lay still with her hand flat on the boards, and after a moment, she could feel it in her palm. Very small, very regular. A beat under the wood at something like the pace of a slow walk. She had felt that before in the sheds at Toval. She knew what a floor felt like with machinery under it, and she had known it since she was 5 years old, and her whole body told her that somewhere below her a shaft was going round. Then it stopped, and she lay in the dark and counted to 200, and it did not come back, and she got up anyway. She took the candle down the loft stair in a horn lantern, and stood in the machine room in 3 inches of water. The wheel outside was dead in its pit, and she had looked at it in daylight with her own eyes. There was nothing in that building with a fire in it or a hand on it, and she was the only person within half a mile. At 20 minutes past 3 it started again, and this time it went on for 11 minutes by her mother's watch. It was strongest under one particular board about 4 feet in from the wall, and when she pressed her fingers into the joint of that board she could feel it going round. Her first answer was the obvious one, and she held on to it for 9 days, and the obvious answer was the main wheel. A breast wheel sits in a pit, and a pit fills, and if enough water had backed into that pit in heavy rain, then perhaps the wheel was being shifted a few degrees at a time and carrying that movement into the building through the upright shaft. It was the only piece of machinery in the place big enough to make a floor move. So she took a shovel and a billhook and went at the wheel pit, working from first light because she had 1 candle a night and meant to keep it that way. She cut out the willow and dug the silt out in barrow loads. By the 25th of October she had the bottom of the wheel clear, and her hands in a state she had to bind with rag before she could hold a spoon. The wheel had not moved, and she knew that because she had chalked a line across the shroud and onto the stonework on the first day, and the 2 halves of the chalk line still met exactly. She sat down on the wet bank and looked at it for a while. Then she got the chalk and did the same to every other object in the building capable of going round. She had no instrument of any kind, so she used chalk, a ball of linen thread, 3 inches of tallow candle, and the tin cup. The cup was the best of them, because filled to a scratch mark and set on the boards it showed the beat at times when her own hand could feel nothing at all. She moved it from board to board across the machine room like a woman laying a table until she had chalked the floor into a map of where the beat was strong and where it was nothing. The map came out as a line that ran from the north wall, under the 2nd and 3rd vats, and stopped dead 11 feet short of the south wall. She hung the thread with a nail on the end from the joist above the strongest board, and the nail swung always across the line and never along it. Then she set the candle on the floor at the north wall in the middle of the night with every door in the building shut. The flame leaned and kept leaning, and a place with air moving through it is a place that is open somewhere underneath. And then the thing that turned all of it round, which she wrote in the buying book on the 3rd of November because she had no other paper. It only happened after rain. Not during. After. She kept the record for 6 weeks in pencil on the back leaves of the marbled book. In the same hand she had used to write down 100 weight of white linen at a penny 3 farthings. Rain on the night of the 16th, beat at 2 and again at 20 past 3. Rain all day the 20th, beat that night in 3 spells. Then 11 dry days at the end of October without 1 beat in them, so that she began to think she had imagined the whole business. Then the storm on the 1st of November and the beat back at 9 in the evening for the best part of 2 days. Whatever it was running on water, and on water that was not in the head race, because the head race was a dry ditch she had cleared out with her own hands. So she walked the property, which she should have done in the first week, 4 acres and a bit of wet meadow with a hedge of blackthorn along the south boundary that gave the place its name and cut her arms to pieces. On the 8th of November, in a low field 200 yards above the mill, she found a line in the grass. It was nothing much to look at, a shallow trough about 7 feet across running from the brook down toward the mill, filled in and grassed over so long ago that the sheep grazed straight across it. But the grass in it was darker, and it stayed wet 3 days after the field beside it had dried. It ran dead straight, and nothing in a wet meadow runs dead straight unless a man put it there. The small find came 2 days later, and it was the one she did not understand. At the east end of the mill there was a cellar under the old size house, and she had left it alone because the steps were broken and the smell coming up was bad. She went down on the 10th with the lantern into a low brick chamber half silted, and in the north wall, set into a stone block, there was a bearing. It was not a modern one, but a brass bush in a cast housing with a cap held by 2 square-headed bolts, and lettering cast into the face of the cap in French. She scraped the muck off it with the back of the knife until she could read it, and it said Fonderie Ledru, Rouen. The bearing was empty, because whatever shaft had run in it had been drawn out, and the hole through the wall behind it plugged with a block of oak. But the housing was packed with grease, and the grease had a black crust on it. And when she pushed her thumb through the crust, the stuff underneath was still soft and still smelled of tallow. She sat on the cellar step with the lantern between her boots and thought about who had been down there greasing a bearing with no shaft in it, in a mill shut for 3 years, and the answer she came to was nobody. Air had not been able to get at it, and tallow that cannot get at air keeps the way a sealed pot of dripping keeps, which told her something better than a caller in the night, because it told her the housing had been closed up on purpose by a man who thought the shaft was coming back. The papers Crowther had handed her across the counter were in a canvas wallet tied with tape. She had read them in October for the water rights and put them away, and in the middle of November she took them out and read them for everything else. There were 4 things in the wallet worth having. The lease itself, dated 1811, granted the ground and the right to take water off the Alder Brook for the working of the mill, with no limit of quantity and no end date, and that one clause was worth more than everything else in the building put together, although she did not know it yet. There was a schedule from the Kent Fire Office, dated 1854, listing the buildings and the machinery for insurance. There was a bundle of drying records which said nothing except how many hours the loft doors had stood open day after day for 17 years. And there was an inventory taken at a sale in 1839, when the mill last changed hands. The insurance schedule listed 1 waterwheel, breast, 14 feet, with the sum insured against it. The inventory of 1839, which was 15 years older, listed under the heading of the mill, and its going gear the words, wheels, 2, 1 within. She read that line about 9 times. She counted her money on the 18th of November, and had £2, 4 shillings and 9 pence. She wrote the sum on the flyleaf of the buying book in pencil, put 9 pence in her pocket and the rest back in the tin, and set the tin in the roof space over the loft stair under a loose tile. Then she walked to Farley and bought a loaf, 2 ounces of tea, a quarter of bacon, and half a pound of candles, and came back with 5 pence. The beer house at the Farley crossroads was kept by a woman named Ellen Marsh, 61, who baked on Tuesdays and Fridays and sold what she did not want herself, and who from the middle of November put a loaf aside for Eleanor on the Friday whether Eleanor came for it or not. She never once asked about the machinery. She had been born at Yalding and thought all mills were damp and all millers were liars, and she died in 1871 without ever walking down the lane to look at the place. The millwright was another matter. Thomas Ashe, 58 of Toville, had put in and taken out mill gear up and down that valley since he was 14, and had worked at Blackthorn twice, in 1849 and in 1855. Eleanor walked over on the 21st of November and stood in his yard and told him she had a shaft turning under her floor and no water in her wheel pit. He heard her out and then told her, not unkindly, that she had a rat in a duct and a bad night behind her. She said the rat had kept time for 11 minutes. He said a woman sleeping alone in an empty mill in the wet would hear a good deal. She took out the buying book and showed him 6 weeks of pencil, rain and no rain, hours and minutes, board by board, and the chalk map she had copied onto the back leaf. Ashe read the whole of it standing up in the cold, and then he read the line out of the 1839 inventory, 1 within, and he stopped talking about rats. He came down on the 23rd with a crowbar, 2 ripping chisels, and a boy of 19 named Jonas Dell who worked for him and ate more than he was paid. Eleanor had no money, so they agreed that she would pay him 3 shillings and 6 pence a day when the mill made money, and that if it never made money, he would take the scale beam and the brass out of the size house and call it settled. They lifted the floor at the north end of the machine room along the chalk line, starting from the board she had marked in October. Under the boards there was a bearer of oak 9 inches square, black with age and hard as iron, and under that a void, and out of the void came a smell of cold water and old brick, and enough cold air to flatten the lantern. The shaft was 3 feet down, oak, octagonal, about 10 inches across the flats, with iron gudgeons and an iron collar, running along the axis of the building from the north wall into the dark, black with wet, with a slick of water on the brickwork below it. It was not turning, because there had been no rain for 5 days. Ash got down on the bearer and put his hand on it, and stayed like that for a while. He said the mill had been built twice. There had been a smaller mill on that brook before the present building, working one small wheel set inside the fabric, under the floor, in a chamber fed off a leat that came in high. When they rebuilt in the 1790s and put the big breast wheel outside, they had not taken the old gear out, because taking it out meant lifting the floor and pulling down half the north wall, and it cost nothing to leave it. So they had left it, and men had been walking about on top of it for 70 years. They followed the shaft north on their bellies over the bearer, taking up 2 more boards to do it, and 11 feet in they came to a wall. It was brick, laid across the void from floor to crown, and it was not old work like the rest, because the mortar was harder, and the courses were cleaner, and there were 4 rows of headers where a man had closed an opening in a hurry. Ash put his ear on it, then moved along and put his ear lower down and told her to be quiet. Eleanor knelt in the wet brick dust with the lantern and heard it for herself. Water, not falling but moving, slow and heavy, on the other side of the brick, the way a full ditch moves. They took 4 bricks out of the bottom course on the 24th of November, and it cost them most of the day, and when the 4th came away, the water came through the gap ankle deep in about a minute, and then stopped rising and simply ran, off through the old wheel chamber and away under the south wall on a fall of its own, which meant there was a tail channel down there as well, and it was still open. The old leat had never gone anywhere. When the brook shifted its course, the leat had gone under, silted and grassed over in the low field. But the channel itself was cut deep and lined, and it had a fall on it, so that in wet weather the groundwater and the brook overflow still found it, and still ran to the mill and into the old wheel chamber. Once every few weeks in a wet winter it ran hard enough and long enough to shift the small wheel that stood in it, a few turns a minute, in the dark, under the floor, for 3.5 years, in a building that every man in Kent had priced as an empty shell. They cleared 80 yards of it in 8 days with the boy Dell and a hired horse and 2 men from Farley at 8 pence a day each in their dinner, which Eleanor paid for with the last of the tin and £1 borrowed from Ellen Marsh at no interest. Ash lifted the crown of the wheel chamber on the 4th of December. The wheel was there, 6 feet across, elm on an oak axle, with the paddles pitted and 2 of them gone and the rest sound, because they had been under water since the year Napoleon was a young man. They let the water in at noon. It came down the leat brown and slow and then faster, and it went into the chamber, and the wheel took it and began to move, and the shaft turned. The whole floor of the machine room came alive under their boots, and Jonas Dell said something out loud that his mother would not have liked. Eleanor stood on the bearer with her hand flat on the boards and said nothing. Then the noise changed. It came from the far end, from the block in the north wall, and it went up out of a groan into a hard, dry shriek they could feel in their teeth. Ash was shouting before she had finished turning round, because the far bearing was running dry on a shaft that had swelled with 3 years of water and gone out of true, and it was hot enough to smoke inside a minute. She went up the ladder and out into the field and put the paddle down in the leat with the flat of her boot, and it took her 3 tries. The water backed and stood and went round through the grass, and the noise fell away and the shaft slowed and stopped. Ash climbed out after her and said that another quarter of an hour would have had the shaft pick up the bearer and take the floor of the machine room with it. So she knew what it was now, and it had taken her 7 weeks. She had a wheel that turned, a shaft that would tear her building apart if she let it, a leat that only ran when it rained. No bearing brasses, no rags, no boiler, no vat crew, no size, no customer, and 2 shillings and a penny. The mystery was finished, and nothing else was. Word of the hired men and the horse got to Maidstone inside a fortnight, because it always does. Crowther came down the lane himself on the 19th of December in a dog cart, in a good coat, and did not get out of it. He looked at the cleared trench in the low field for a while. Then he said he had been thinking that he dealt with her sharply in October, and that he would take the property back off her hands and give her £25 for the trouble she had been put to. She said no, and he said 30 then. And he said it too quickly. And both of them heard him say it too quickly. She thanked him and told him the mill was not for sale. Crowther sat with the reins in his hands and looked at the building for a good deal longer than a man looks at a roof he has called worthless. Then he turned the cart in the gateway and went back up the lane. On the 4th of January, she walked to Hunton to buy rags from a dealer named Sim Verrall she had bought from a dozen times, and Verrall would not sell to her. He was decent enough about it to be embarrassed, and he said he had a standing arrangement with the Maidstone house, and that the Maidstone house had lately reminded him what a standing arrangement meant. She got the same answer at Wateringbury, and a worse one at Yalding. She could have shouted about that, and it would have changed nothing, because the arrangement was legal and ordinary, and every large buyer in the county had one. But the truth underneath it was harder than Crowther, and she was one of the few people in Kent who could see the whole of it. Rags were scarce and getting scarcer, and the whole trade was short of them. Every mill on the Medway wanted good white linen. There was not enough of it in England to keep them going, and prices had climbed for 10 years. The mills that survived were the mills with contracts, buying by the ton off the London dealers on terms, agreed before the cloth ever came into the country. Blackthorn had no contract, no credit, and no name, and a woman who walks up to a dealer with £2 in her hand is sold what nobody else wanted at the price of what everybody wanted. So she sat in the counting room on the 5th of January, with the fire scar still on the flags, and did the arithmetic. The arithmetic said that if she tried to make writing paper, she would be bankrupt before Lady Day. That was the night she asked herself the other question. She had spent 18 years being told what good paper was, and nobody had ever asked her what most paper was actually for. She thought about Ellen Marsh wrapping a loaf in a piece of paper that had already been round something else once. She thought about the grocers in Maidstone weighing out sugar and soap and candles by the hundred every market day, and about the drapers, and the ironmongers with their nails, and the goods traffic on the railway that had to go into something before it went into a crate. None of those people wanted a beautiful sheet. They wanted a sheet that would hold 4 pounds of wet fish without going through, and take a crease without splitting, and cost next to nothing, and come every week without fail. Brown wrapping paper, the lowest grade in the trade, the stuff nobody puts his name on. She wrote 3 words on the back leaf of the buying book under the rain records. Coarse, strong, cheap. And the value of that grade, to a woman with 2 shillings and a wheel that only ran when it rained, was in everything it did not have to be. It did not have to be white, so she needed no bleach and no bleaching house. It did not have to be smooth, so she needed no glazing machine she could not have paid for. It did not have to be sized for ink. And it did not have to be made of good linen rag, which was the one thing she could not get at any price. Which left the question of what it could be made of instead. Straw was not her idea, and she never once said it was. Kent had been making paper out of straw for years by then. Upper Toval had been working straw about 1859, and there were mills down at Snodland doing it in quantity, and any sorter who had been in the trade for a decade had handled the stuff and knew roughly what it was. Eleanor had a sample of straw board in her box that she had picked off a bench at Toval in 1862 and kept because it interested her. It was ugly, yellow-brown, and stiff, and when she pulled it against itself, it did not tear the way rag paper of that weight would tear. What straw had, for her, was that it grew in the field over the hedge. After harvest, wheat straw in that valley was worth 1 shilling a hundredweight to a man who had to shift it, and less than that to a man who had already stacked all he wanted for his stock. It was the cheapest fibre in England, and it was treated as waste by every mill that could afford not to use it. She spent the whole of January and half of February earning the money to start. She took in sorting work, piece rate, for a mill at Toval that was short-handed, at 8p a hundredweight. She brought a woman from Farley in with her, Ruth Wickens, 41, widowed, with 2 boys at home, who could not read but who could learn a heap in an afternoon, and never made the same mistake twice. Between them they sorted a little over 11 tons that winter in the cold end of the Blackthorn rag store. Eleanor cleared £4 15 shillings and put every penny of it into the mill. The money went like this: 31 shillings to Ash for a patch and a new stay on the boiling kiln. £2 4 to a founder at Maidstone for bearing brasses to Ash's pattern, and 1 gudgeon. 11 shillings for lime, and 9 and 6p for second-hand felts from a mill at Hale that was throwing them out. 4 shillings for straw, which bought her a great deal of straw. 6p for a hasp and staple on the size house door, because by February she had things worth taking. Ash trued the shaft in place over 3 days with wedges and a straight edge and a good deal of language, set the new brasses, and put a hatch and paddle on the leat so that the water could be shut off in half a minute rather than 3 tries with the flat of a boot. They cut the straw with a chaff cutter borrowed from a farmer named Reuben Fell, 36, who carted for the hop growers and who charged her nothing for it, and who told everybody at the Farley Crossroads for the next 20 years that he had lent the first tool that ever went into Blackthorn. They boiled it with lime in the old kiln and washed it, and ran it through the rag engine on the underfloor drive with the roll set high, brushing rather than cutting, because a straw fiber is short to begin with, and anything that shortens it further gives you paper you can put your thumb through. The first sheets came off the mold on the 9th of March in the year 1866. Eleanor Pike hung them in the loft where the roof was whole and stood and looked at them. Then she went out and sold 4 reams of them to a grocer at Barming named Walter Sedge, 47, at 2 shillings and 9 pence the ream. They were terrible. She had a second order before she knew that, which was the worst of it. A warehouse keeper at Maidstone named Nathaniel Rook, 50, who bought for a firm of wholesale grocers, took 12 reams on the strength of the price and said he would take 12 a month if the stuff held up. It did not hold up. Sedge sent word on the 16th of March that his boy could not wrap a bar of soap in it without the sheet going at the fold, and Rook sent the whole 12 reams back on a cart on the 20th with nothing on the docket but the word returned. Ruth Wickens carried them into the rag store 1 bundle at a time while Eleanor stood in the yard. The paper was brittle where it was thick, and thin where it had no business being thin. Held up to the loft light it looked like weather on a map. Dark patches and pale ones. And along the pale ones it came apart in the hand almost without effort. About 1/5 of every ream was not saleable at any price. Ash said it was the wheel, and that the drive ran uneven because the leat ran uneven, and no vatman can make a level sheet on a shaking floor. Eleanor did not think it was the wheel, and she took 2 days she could not afford to prove it. She ran the engine with the hatch full open and the water steady and made 12 sheets, and they came out with the same pale streaks in the same way. Then she beat a small quantity by hand in a tub with a maul, like a woman washing, with the drive stopped altogether, and those 12 came out streaked as well. So it was not the drive, and it was not the straw, because a mill 15 miles off was making saleable stuff out of the same crop. It was what happened to the straw before it ever reached the vat. And when she saw it, she was angry with herself for a week, because it was the one thing in the whole trade she should have seen first. She had been buying straw by the load and boiling it by the load. Wheat straw off the top of a stack that has stood out in the weather is not the same material as wheat straw out of the middle of the same stack, because the weathered stuff is soft and part rotted, and breaks down fast and goes to a fine mush. The sound stuff is hard and waxy and takes longer to cook. She had been putting both into the same kiln for the same hours, and then into the same vat, so that half her furnish was cooked to nothing and half of it was still half raw, and every sheet she made was a mixture of 2 failures. It was the sorting shed all over again. One colored rag in the white heap spoils the vat 4 days later, and her mother had taught her that before she could read. Feel it before you look at it. So she sorted it, not by farm and not by load but by hand, grade by grade, the way she had been taught to sort cloth in the dark. She made Ruth Wickens do it beside her until the 2 of them could put a handful of straw into one of 3 heaps by the feel of it in about 1.5 seconds. Weathered and soft in the first, sound and hard in the second, anything moldy or full of grass seed in the third, which went to the pigs at Farley. Each grade got its own boiling and its own hours in the kiln, 40 minutes between the shortest and the longest. Then the grades went back together at the vat in a fixed proportion. The paper that came off the mold after that was not beautiful. It was brown going on gray, and it had specks in it, and no stationer in England would have put his name on a ream of it. It held 4 pounds of wet fish, and it took a fold and came back and took it again, and it did not go at the crease. Walter Sedge took 8 reams on the 2nd of April and paid cash, and came back on the 24th for 16 more, and said his boy had stopped complaining, which he called the highest recommendation a grocer can give. Through that summer, Blackthorn made brown wrapping paper 4 days a week when the leat ran and 2 when it did not. And in August, Ash put in a small second-hand steam engine, bought at a sale at Snodland for £11 on 8 months of credit that Walter Sedge stood surety for, so that the mill could work through a dry month like everybody else. By September, there were 7 names on the wages book. Ruth Wickens ran the sorting at 9 shillings a week. Jonas Dell ran the kiln. 2 women came up from Farley for the vat and the loft. A man named Whitlock did the carting. Ash was retained at 3 and 6 pence a day whenever he was wanted, and was owed a great deal less than he had been. Crowther came in October. He came because a firm at Rochester held him to a contract for 400 reams of wrapping paper over the winter, and because the Snodland mill that supplied him had lost its main drive shaft in the last week of September and could deliver nothing before Christmas. He tried Dartford and he tried London, and everybody in the trade was short because everybody in the trade was always short. Then a man in his own counting house told him there was stock 2 miles down the loose road at the place he used to own. He came down the lane in the dog cart on the 11th of October, 1866, 1 year to the day from the morning in the counting house, and this time he got out of the cart. The yard was full. There was straw in the shed and lime in the pit and a cart being loaded. The machine room doors were open because of the heat, so that a man standing in them saw the whole of it at once. The old wheel turning under the floor with the boards up on one side so the shaft could be watched. The engine going. The rag engine turning over a furnish of straw and cheap gray cotton. 2 women at the vat with their arms wet to the elbow. The stink of lime and hot size. And above it the drying loft with the louvers open and 1,100 sheets hanging in the draft. The noise of the whole place, which is not a pleasant noise and never is. Silas Crowther stood in the doorway of a building he had called a roof over a bad debt, and looked at it, and said nothing at all for a considerable time. Then he asked what she had in stock and what she wanted for it. She had 62 reams finished in the loft. She said the price was 3 shillings and 3 pence the ream, which was the Maidstone price that week, not a farthing over and not a farthing under. He said his house always settled at 90 days, as she well knew. She said her house settled on delivery in coin, and that if that did not suit him there was a mill at Dartford, which he had already tried on the Tuesday. Crowther paid her £10 1 shilling and 6 pence on the doorstep of the size house out of a pocketbook, in front of Ruth Wickens and Jonas Dell and the carter. She counted it twice before she wrote the receipt, because she had been taught to count money in front of the man who was paying it. He took the 62 reams that afternoon and ordered 200 more before Christmas. He did not congratulate her, and he did not apologize then or ever. He got up into the cart and sat a moment looking at the north wall where the leat came in under the stones. Eleanor thought he was working out, a year too late, what the line in the low field had been. The end of it is smaller than people expect, and truer for being small. Eleanor Pike did not become rich. In the year to Michaelmas 1867, Blackthorn Mill turned out a little under 9,000 reams of brown wrapping paper and cleared, after wages and straw and lime and coal and the lease and the credit on the engine, £141. Out of that she had the east roof retiled with second-hand tiles for £19, both loft valleys releaded, and the machine room floor relayed over the shaft with a proper inspection hatch. She paid Thomas Ashe every penny of the deferred 3 and 6 pence a day going back to the 23rd of November, which came to £14 9 shillings, and she paid Ellen Marsh her pound. She kept a standing order with Sedge, one with Rook, and one with a soapworks at Aylesford, and the Crowther orders came in every quarter for 11 years and were always paid on delivery in coin. She wore the same working dress she had worn in the sorting shed. She kept £9 in the tin under the tile in the roof space over the loft stair and would not spend it on anything. She was, for the first time since she was 19, not in debt to anybody at all. The local name for the place changed twice. In the winter of 1865 it was the Dead Mill, and by 1866 the men at the Farley Crossroads were calling it Pike's Folly. About 1870 they went back to calling it Blackthorn, which is what it is called now. On the last day of the year 1867 she sat in the counting room with the account book, the proper one, bound, that she had bought for 4 shillings when the second Crowther order came in. The first entry in it was not an entry at all. On the flyleaf, in pencil, in her own hand, in the 10th month of 1865, she had written down what she was owed. Silas Crowther, £18 and 7 shillings. She drew one line through it with a rule, and underneath she wrote one word, which was Blackthorn, and then she shut the book and put it in the drawer. Eleanor Pike was 25 years old. She had been a rag sorter with 4 shillings and 8 pence to her name and a dead woman's knife in her pocket. She had been cheated of £18 and 7 shillings by a man who never afterwards used her Christian name. No sum that ever went through her books in the 30 years that followed did as much work for her as that one did. The room was quiet, and down through the flags and the boards, faint and even and about the pace of a slow walk, she could feel the floor going round.